Welcome to Practical Shamanism. I'm Katie Weatherup. I'm a former engineer with 20 years of experience working as a shamanic practitioner, and I hope to help you to connect to your personal power and magic and to support you in living a really good life that just keeps getting better. Thank you so much for joining me. So, continuing on to part 2 of figuring out whether you should stay or go when you are deeply heart connected to someone and at the same time ease has left the building in terms of the relationship. There's trigger and there's squabbling and there's hurt feelings and it's hard. You're not finding just grace and joy with the person, and it's raised the question of whether you should stay in the connection. And this comes up most potently in romantic and sexual relationships, largely because our hormones and our instincts are such a potent part of this. And so our instincts will compel us towards someone that we're really sexually attracted to because they have the right amount of genetic diversity to make healthy babies. But we don't think in those terms. The instincts are just compelling us in that direction. And if you're attracted to same-sex partners, I don't think you get a pass on this. I think the instincts just move with sexual attraction, and that can be really compelling. So there's this primal old part of ourself that has this agenda of perpetuating the species, even if birth control is being used or it's not physically impossible, that is going to draw us really potently toward a connection if that's in play. However, it can come up in friendships. It can come up in your relationship with your sister or your brother or a parent or a work relationship. Like there are all these places where you can be really, really ambivalent about a connection, particularly a long-term connection, genuinely love and care about the person and not be having success with them and be in the process of, is it fixable? Is there something to change? Is there something to work out? So if you haven't listened to part 1, please do go ahead and listen to part 1. As I share there, it's a complicated map. And so I really want to provide people with a map, first of all, if you're in the middle of that, to help you to find a way out of that. And if you're not in the middle of it, but you've suffered a lot with it in the past, as I have, to build the confidence that you have the tools that you need to make a good decision for yourself if you end up in that complicated place again that is holistic and takes care of yourself, that doesn't throw away really successful relationships because of old wounding of yours that has just gotten really, really triggered, or at the same time doesn't stay in unhealthy dynamics way too long. I've certainly had the experience of getting clear of something and being like, oh, I wish I'd done that so much sooner. It is so good not to be trying to match energy with that person anymore. There's this huge sense of relief. And so that self-trust, there's a kind of a neat phrase that trust is an inside job. So I can trust you to be you, and I can trust my discernment to have a pretty good picture, because being who I am and developing the skills I've had gives me a lot of ability to have really, really good discernment. So I trust in my discernment. I recognize that there's no substitute for time and knowing someone, so I'm not going to say I could perfectly read somebody on a first date. I can certainly rule people out on a first date or a first meeting, but, sometimes there's enough affinity and appeal that it just takes a while. It takes a while for people to feel relaxed enough to be the most authentic version of themselves, and that is something that just takes time. So one of the things that's sort of interesting and strange about having the shamanic abilities that I do and the sensitivity and the intuition is that I can know someone very, very quickly at the surface level. Hi, how are you? What do you do for a living? And at the deep soul level, like I can see the map of their soul if they've opened themselves up and that's something they are allowing and making available. But all the middle stuff, like how do you react in the morning? What happens when you get triggered? What are your ethics in day-to-day situations? Where do you abandon your ethics because you want something really bad? Like, these are really important things, and there's no way to really tell that at the beginning, especially because people are so story-based, and so their story about themselves may not match their actual actions. And that's one of my huge red flags. If I see a big gulf between who someone says they are and who I experience them to be, without making anybody right or wrong. That's a back away from the person, because I have an incredibly strong need for congruency, which means what I experience of you and what you tell me about yourself match up, because I get really confused and disoriented if my energetic senses are giving me different information than the person is. And that's not good for me. So it's a particular additional layer of complication that goes with being the person who's engaged on some of these intuitive levels, reading energetics as well as, what's being seen and what the person smells like and how it feels to be cuddled up to them and all the rest of the stuff. So one of the ways that I think is really useful to evaluate a relationship is the Stephen Covey concept of the emotional bank account. And what I like about this is it's completely separate from how much you love someone. So you can love someone profoundly to the very depths of your being, absolute, deep, profound, unconditional love, and not be able to relate successfully to them because the emotional bank account is consistently overdrawn. And one of the things to pay attention to, because when we're in this dilemma about relationships, sometimes it's really clear, but sometimes there's a question of like, is it me or is it them? Do I have some things that could use some healing and attention, or is this dynamic not as successful as it could be? So I think that there's a certain amount where I've worked with certain people where their level of reactivity and trigger to pretty much every human on the planet is just so high that there's pretty much a stopwatch clicking down for any dynamic that goes to any amount of depth, because sooner or later the person can't help but bump against what's unhealed, and the person is so much in story, or they're engaging a lot with the victim, persecutor, rescuer triangle, like that overlay. And those are good things to be able to spot in other people. If they are super, super angry about a bunch of people from their past and they haven't seemed to have come into the acceptance and the releasing and the neutrality. I'm not a fan of love and light to your exes, but I am a fan of you haven't really healed everything up until you're neutral about your parents or your siblings or people who hurt you in the past. And I keep doing inner work until I get to neutrality. And that's very possible. I'm just done with them. I wish them well, no more so than I wish the children in China well and the birds in Africa well, and may all beings be well. I just genuinely humanitarian and, sense of may we all be well together. I use humanitarian, but it also applies to the trees and the rivers and everything else. But the personal investment in may they be well, I just have a distinction. I have no personal investment either way. I just don't care. I'm just neutral. And that's a really good place to be with someone who's hurt you, where they just don't cross your mind. And lots of ways to get to that. And I'll go into, once you've firmly decided to leave and are clear and on board and taking right action to that, how you can get to that neutral place where the person isn't crossing your mind and you aren't magnetized toward the loop of thinking about them. But one of the ways that you can set yourself up for future success with that is by getting present in a really focused way with the question of, do I stay, do I go? And if it's a loud question inside of you, getting to closure sooner rather than later. And that may require facilitation. You may do couples therapy, you may do individual therapy, you may work with someone like me. I love helping people untangle all these complicated layers. I think it's something that is really a specialty of mine, because I've tripped myself up that way and now I don't. And that feels really powerful, and I absolutely love to help people have a more graceful exit from that complicated on the fence place than what happened to me, because it can become very all-consuming if you're deeply conflicted about staying or going in a relationship. And it'll be a lot easier on the other side to stop thinking about the person and move through the process the less time you spend intensely engaged with these questions. So resolving them efficiently and elegantly and well in a timely manner is a gift to your future self. On the other hand, we don't want to rush or make the decision quickly. So one of the things, going back to the emotional bank account, is that it's good to assess whether every single person in your life is ending up massively overdrawn and you're breaking up with all the people, friends, family members, etc. There's not a lot of success, because that's a different kind of wounding, and definitely some facilitated therapy and inner work would be really, really good. Compassionate communication is a really great skill, because when you master compassionate communication and the principles underneath, as well as something like Byron Katie work, where you can dismantle your stories, you can get really clear where you're not causing someone else's trigger. So you're less likely to trigger someone if you're not participating and coming to them with a story that you're right and they're wrong, and your communication sees and hears and understands them before you seek to be seen and heard, while absolutely requiring that that be part of the dynamic at some point. Again, I try not to get heard by people who are really in big emotions. They just don't have capacity. It's like trying to yell while there's, heavy machinery 2 feet away. There's just no point. Like, come back when it's quiet and, you can actually be heard. I don't meet a lot of people in bars for many reasons, but the volume of not being able to have a conversation factors significantly into that. That's a part of it. But once you've done a modicum of inner work and you have some really good tools to not escalate conflicts by making someone bad and trying to make them hear that you're right and they're wrong, and you've done some Byron Katie work so you can dismantle your stories, and maybe you're following the Brené Brown don't type, don't text, don't talk when you're super triggered, and you've got a pretty good baseline skill. Those are really, really great things to invest in inside or outside of relationships. And once you've sort of covered your bases on that, then looking at the emotional bank account, it's important to just kind of let it land where it lands. And I have an interesting fellow, he writes these pieces that sometimes really trigger me and sometimes I really, agree with. But one of the things he said was, our boundaries aren't up to us. And I thought that was really interesting, because it's this idea that there are core things that are just not okay with us, and no amount of pretzeling or talking ourselves out of it or anything else is going to make that be different. And it's kind of a complicated distinction, which he didn't develop, but my mind went off and really thought about, because we have these stories. So an example of a story would be some of the ways that women will try to make sure there's enough engagement of a certain type. Like, we try to make a good deal about sexuality. Alison Armstrong goes into this in a really interesting, complicated way in her, discussions on celebrating men and sex, and exploring like a fabulous content. It's kind of deep down the rabbit hole for her content. But in looking at this, women will have rules like it has to be 3 dates or 5 dates, or he has to be the one to call. I'm not going to initiate. Like there are these rules. And I wouldn't say that those boundaries are the ones that aren't up to us. I'd say those are an overlay that we're trying to put onto something to concretize it, to get our needs met, to give it a pass-fail, as opposed to like the before we have story, before we have idea, before we've taken in anybody else's ideas, there's some core stuff that just does or doesn't work with us. For example, the need to be seen and heard and known and not misinterpreted, I would argue, is a pretty core part of who I am, that is something I can work with it. Like, sometimes being seen and heard and known is just flat out not available, and I have ways to hold myself through it. So I'm not like chasing homeless people down the street trying to explain, my compassionate nature. But at the same time, for sustainability in a relationship, that's going to be a really important piece. And if you get in touch with, this is some really nuanced inner work with, what are the boundaries that just aren't up to you? They aren't a story that you've made up. They aren't somebody that says, well, if he really respected you, he'd do this. If she respected you, she'd have this. They aren't like some society Valentine's Day bill of goods you got sold, but they're the really core, this is what does and doesn't work for me. And those, you can have so much more success in spotting sustainability in relationship, because when those are being crossed, no matter how much you love the person, it's going to be a take on the emotional bank account every time it happens. And if there's enough positive, like I really, again, it's an Alison Armstrong distinction. This is from her In Sync with the Opposite Sex, where she talks about the alignment of what you love to give being something the person loves to receive, and what they love to give being what you love to receive, being a really good thing to look at. Because if you want to cook for someone and they don't really care, your beautiful gift isn't being celebrated and valued. It's treated lightly. Whereas if they award you a huge number of points because you cooked them a simple meal, that's really awesome. For someone who wanted me to express love by cooking them a meal, they'd be super bummed. It's just not my jam. It's not really what I'm going to do. I'm more pragmatic about, let's get food handled so we can have a different experience. And so if home cooking a meal from a partner was a way that they really, really filled up their emotional bank account, we might not be a good match, at least in that respect. So it's a great thing to look at, because the more somebody provides something that you love and cherish and value authentically, joyfully, just because it's who they are and it's what they want to provide, that gives you a more resilient emotional bank account. But there's certain things that are just such big withdrawals, you can't tolerate it. So even someone you felt marvelous with, if the fact that they lied to you about important things, finances or monogamy or safer sex practices or whatever, that probably for most people wouldn't be sustainable, no matter how much joyful things that you loved you were getting out of it. And what I like about the emotional bank account as a framework, and I've added all of my own stuff onto it, is that it can run separately than my love. So I can deeply, profoundly love someone, but when I start taking from that love to replenish an emotional bank account that is consistently overdrawn. So the things they do with me that make me happy, that work for me, are less than the things they do that are not okay with me, that don't work for me, over time is going to drain an emotional bank account. And there just isn't ease or sustainability. That's when you start getting really reactive to petty things because of the non-sustainability of the good feeling in the relationship. We really want these upward spirals, and we want to be in a generous place with someone where we're like, wow, I didn't like what you did, but in the grand scheme of things, it was a take. It was definitely a take that you forgot that we were going to have lunch and stood me up. But, we've had 27 lunches before that where that absolutely didn't happen. It was super random. Okay, I didn't like it, but it's not going to crash the relationship. So really just pragmatically looking at, like, are we staying in the black? Are we staying in positive as far as the emotional bank account? And is that happening naturally? Because anytime that it takes a ton of energy to sustain a relationship, I kind of feel like that's a young person's game. Like, I've done that when I was younger, and I'm like, I'm just too old and tired. I'm in my mid-40s, so I don't usually think of myself as old and tired, but some of what I did when I was younger sounds exhausting. I'm like, I need it to work with ease. I have this busy, dynamic shamanic practice and, all of these things going in my life. So if I have to work and work and work to keep us in a positive emotional bank account, it just takes massive amounts of energy. I think I'll let this one go. And I didn't feel that way when I was younger. I had such a longing. I think my hormones easing up as I get older, for many of us, that does us a favor because the loudness of that starts to soften a little bit. So I can definitely say, 40s are a lot better than 30s as far as being able to make really holistic, balanced decisions. And I think part of that is the inner work that I've done, but part of that is just straight up hormones for the journey. So part of why I'm offering this is I think it's really useful when we don't have these parts of us in an adversarial relationship that are trying to make a decision. So people think a lot where my head and my heart are arguing. And no good comes of having an inner power struggle between your head and your heart. You need to take both of them with you, whether you stay or go. And likewise, what I talked about in the other, where there's more chakra mismatch than alignment, you can have an argument between your chakras, with some chakras voting stay, and other chakras voting no, go, this isn't working. And then it gets really loud inside of you. And what I really hate about this place for myself and for the clients I work with is it undermines your peace and your sense of well-being when you're really loud inside with an internal argument of, do I stay or do I go? Does this work for me or does this not work for me? It's very, very expensive. And one of the things that I often see with the women that I work with is our minds are apt to write like the amount of material that goes into a PhD dissertation on all of the object of our affections issues and their childhood upbringing and where they went astray and what needs they didn't get met and who they are and how it is their fault or it's not their fault, or and I get that. Like, we live in a society that's really mentally biased. We really, really work with our minds a lot. We don't get trained in emotional intelligence. So when we're trying to make a decision, we can spin our mind in circles, and it's easier to sit in the low-level problem-solving place than it is to sit with sadness, to sit with like, wow, I'm super bummed. I don't see a way. So when we're emotionally compelled, we often put our mind in service to problem solving, and it goes from how could he be different or she be different? How could the other person be different? Into how could I be different? Maybe I could pretzel myself, and then that doesn't work out. And for sure, when you're looking at this, all the underlying wisdom of don't sweat the small stuff and pick your battles and all that kind of thing certainly applies. But the mind can end up rationalizing anything, as I talked about in the previous version, and a lot of times we just keep perpetually looping on trying to think this through or understand more or solve the problem, and it's just not a good use of our emotional ingenuity and intelligence. And the trouble is that it creates these neural pathways. So if we problem solve and analyze and think it through and go round and round and round and round in our heads for long periods of time, we establish these neural pathways that keep us trying to solve the problem even after we've left the relationship or we've resolved the problem within the relationship. So if the problem was drinking and the person stopped drinking, our brain may still be trying to resolve their drinking, for example. And it's possible to activate neuroplasticity and get the brain to rewire itself to get rid of those grooves and those pathways and those habitual ways of thinking. But it takes a lot of effort. Like, our minds tend to want to not reconsider what they've done because it takes a lot of calories and energy to activate neuroplasticity. So it's totally doable, and it's really good to know how to hack your brain and interrupt those thought grooves of a repeated over and over again painful thought or idea. Like, that's an incredibly useful adult skill. But the less we do that, the sooner we interrupt the process. So if you find yourself overthinking, asking yourself, what am I feeling and where am I feeling it in my body? And how could I just breathe through and be with the sadness or the anger and then the sadness or the fear, or coming back to the core emotion? Because if you're thinking because you're covering up emotionality, then you're not really going to be doing your best thinking. Like your mind under the influence of emotionality is not particularly rational. Your executive brain doesn't work properly. So if you're triggered with someone and trying to think it out, you really want to level the emotional waters before you try to think it through. And again, that's where I think these questions, having a skilled facilitator or even a friend who can listen in a really neutral way, is so useful and powerful in trying to sort these kinds of things. So one thing I want to add in that I think is really important, and this is going to apply a lot more for women, is that when we're in that relationship dilemma, for many of us, our feelings are our compass. So whether it's rational or not, whether all the good reasons in the world, our feelings are our connection to the eternal. They're our sense of who we are and what the right thing is for us. And so for a woman, it's very, very hard to move in a direction that doesn't feel right to her at a deep level. And that connection to the internal, that intuitive nature, that big picture, that connection to all that is. When we're upset and emotional at a low level, it occupies the pathways that would let us feel those bigger picture things of who we are. And so one of the most important things when people are training to do shamanic work or any kind of intuitive work is to recognize that they won't be a clear channel if they're emotionally triggered, because the pathways that we use to hear spirit clearly are taken up by the mind chatter and the disruption. Like, we really need to be quiet and neutral to hear core truth as clearly as possible. And one of the things that trips a lot of intuitive but untrained people up is they'll make up a story in their head, they'll project the energy, and then they'll perceive the energy that they've projected, and then they'll take it as true. And it's really hard because you're using your intuitive sense. You are actually looking out at something and it does match exactly what you imagined. It's just that it was generated from inside of you. You like projected the energy up from the inside and then you read it. And we talk about that in some of our psychological language, where we project things onto people that are actually our issues. And we've probably all experienced having someone super, super mad at us when we were like, you're exactly what you're describing that you're mad about, but that's really not my issue. You're super, super, super angry at someone who is doing exactly what you do on a regular basis. So that shadow work is a really important part. And again, there's a lot of inner work that goes with being able to do this work clearly. And I think that that's super duper important. But for women particularly, and especially spiritual, intuitive, connected to the eternal women, the trouble with leaving a relationship is we're waiting for it to feel right, because that's the most trusted way we move. We're like, okay, it feels right. But if the water's never level enough because of the suffering and the stirred up nature of what we're in the middle of, it's never going to feel right. And it's probably never going to feel right to leave someone that we love deeply to in the relationship, because there will be grief. There will be sadness. I have been so sad, so deeply sad, that someone that I loved immensely, that was a beautiful, luminous soul, wasn't making life choices or didn't have a personality type or didn't have a style that meant we could have something healthy and sustainable. And that was just the truth of it. At the level of fact, they were beautiful. I loved them deeply, and we didn't bring out the best in each other. And it wasn't a healthy place for me to be. And that's sad. There's mourning, genuine sadness of like, wow, this is not a human I get to play with because of X, Y, or Z. And again, it's a calm decision, because when I'm allowing for the grief and the sadness, I'm not in the trigger and the reactivity. But that's honestly what ultimately comes up for me if I really love someone and I need to step away. But there's nothing about that that feels good or feels like the right thing. And for many of us in our culture, grief is a really big shadow emotion. We avoid it like the plague. It's one of the darkest things that we most resist. I work with a lot of clients who get really devastated by a loss in their life, because they're not only processing the grief from the loss, but all the numbing that they've done of grief over the years. So they have a lot of emotional debt around grief. So what moves when they have a grief situation that's too big to ignore is really huge and really painful. And so it's necessary to be able to move in ways that are good for yourself and make decisions for yourself when it doesn't feel right, when it doesn't feel like the right thing, when you can't hear your guidance, when you can't get this higher sense. But you can look at these other things like, is the emotional bank account drained? Am I being unreasonably reactive? Have I talked to someone and got some feedback? Am I suffering in this way too much? And at some point, whether it's your own issues or it's the other person's issues, being in a situation where your issues are hammered on and you're triggered all the time is just not good for you. Even if they're the most ascended, angelic, loving, helpful person, if you are in reaction to them all the time. And I get that relationships are complicated. So, I work with people who are living with their parents because that's what economically makes sense for them. But it's a difficult kind of place to hang out. So, I'm not trying to hand wave those emotions. That's a whole different conversation. But recognizing that if you can't get to clarity, one of the ways that I've worked with that, because nothing felt right, because it was so loud inside of me with all these conflicting emotions, all these fears of being alone, the intuitive, the misguided loyalty. Loyalty is a beautiful quality, but we can overuse it in a way that undermines our emotional and psychological health by staying loyal to people in dynamics that would not be sustainable but for our loyalty to them and to the dynamic and to the type of relationship. And that's not super optimal. It's a misuse of a beautiful quality. And so in our efforts to move out, sometimes stepping away in order to get quiet with ourselves without getting closure on the relationship. So the first relationship that I left, which was very complicated for me, I was in my 20s. We were not having a healthy dynamic. I'm sure all of our mutual friends breathed a sigh of relief when we stepped away from each other and quit tormenting each other. We were both really good people, but we were deeply wounded. We were in therapy, but it was not doing the work at the level that we would have needed to be sustainable. I don't know that there's ever a path that we would have been a really, really optimal match, but I had a lot of stuff that came up. So we didn't decide that we were ending the relationship. I just moved out so that we could have our own space to just be in our own business. And it very quickly became clear I was never, ever, ever wanting to live under a roof with that person again. There was a great relief to fully step away, but I needed the space. So that can be a solution, even if it's just an Airbnb for an overnight or staying in a friend's guest bedroom. I know it's harder in COVID times, but I'm really trusting that shortly after the time you listen to this or when you come to it, that there'll be more opportunity to be free range humans and we'll have more choices. Safety balanced first, of course, is really important. So sometimes there are dynamics where COVID is much less of a concern than what you've got going at home, and sometimes it's flipped the other way. But balancing all of that, recognizing that your nature may be to use your feelings and your connection to the divine as your compass, and that compass may just be like standing next to a electromagnetic rock. You can't point to true north, so you got to use the sun or other ways to determine where you're going while you're under the influence, because I feel like it just spins our compass when we're too loud to hear spirit and our feelings are choppy emotional waters, which the truth is they just will be if we're needing to step away from somebody that we love very much. And so I just want to offer this because there's a lot that can go into getting quiet enough in yourself to make the decision, but the constant rumination in your own head and continuing to, have these really reactive dynamics without sort of breaking pattern and finding something else to do can be really, really challenging. And I just have so much compassion. This is a place where there's been a lot of psychological and emotional pain in my life when I really loved someone and really had a profound soul connection, and we were not healthy and sustainable and easeful and aligned. And relationships are complicated, but if there's not more sustainability and ease, there isn't enough emotional and psychological health. Like I'm a really big fan of get healthy and then only date healthy people as best you can. And it can be a little hard to determine that. But the kind of relationships are hard. There are a lot of relationships that are really not meant to be as hard as they are. And as I get older, I've come to value relationships where good feeling and joy and an abundant emotional bank account and my delight in the person most days is sustained without my having to work at it. It's just what rises authentically as my truth. And I think that that's a really important place to seek out, certainly for the kind of relating I want. I'm not particularly inclined as an introvert to spend time with somebody where there isn't a joy, there isn't a value add to my life. It's not just like I have no value on it's kind of so-so, but hey, at least I have someone there, personally. So if that's different for you, obviously this may look really, really different as how you go through this process. But wherever you are, lots of love and compassion, because this sort of thing is legitimately complicated and hard. And when we're in argument with ourselves and there are different parts of us with different agendas, it can be really complicated. And the big picture of this is being able to sit down, like if you were a CEO of a company and the company was having some really significant problems, and you needed to chart a solution, and you needed to do it in a way that kept you good with HR. You weren't abusing your people or breaking the law, and you had the financial ability, like the finance department could back it, and engineering could say, yes, I can solve that problem on the timeline, and marketing could say, yes, we can sell the thing that you're wanting to produce or the service that you're wanting to do. And you need a path that works for all these really critical departments. And when we start looking at ourselves, it doesn't have to be perfect for every aspect of ourselves, but it has to be sustainable and getting those kind of come together in a circle. Our society's gotten really far away from mediation and common ground, and how do we find a path forward that everyone can live with? And I think that we suffer internally from a lack of being able to call an all-hands meeting with ourselves and hear what all the aspects of us have to say, and then chart a course. Because from my point of view, chips fall where they may with the relationship, but the relationship to yourself needs to be sustained. You want to be in healthy, right relationship with yourself. And if that's not available with another person, all things being equal, I would say chips fall where they may with that relationship surviving or not surviving. But these times where you're in deep argument with yourself and should I stay, should I go? And there's intensity around the question. It's not like in the back of your mind, I don't know if we're quite working out, but there's enough of a pain point that it's really seriously occupying your mind. I would say that that's hard on your relationship with yourself, hard to be you in that space. And that's where I'm hoping that this will help you to address those kind of issues in an efficient way and get to clarity one way or another. And likewise, that trust is an inside job. I trust me. That if you've gotten really stuck in this and it's making you reluctant to explore deeper relating with other people because you got so stuck, trusting that you have a better map. Because I got really tangled in some dynamics and it was really painful and it did make me reluctant, but now I don't do that to myself. And so there's a trust in being able to step in and explore with someone, knowing that if I got to this place where I loved them deeply and the emotional bank account wasn't sustainable and we had too much difference to navigate across in a way that had easefulness and sustainability without putting huge amounts of my life effort into it in a way that wasn't particularly fun, then I would be really sad. I would really mourn it, but I trust my ability to step away. And so whether you're in the thick of the problem, needing some better maps, or whether you're someone who just needs a really good plan to be like, oh yeah, okay, that could work and that could work, and I really see this. I have a plan so I can trust myself to step into something. Again, whether it's friendship or romance or a business relationship or whatever it is, we're hardwired to be social creatures. And for my spiritual, energetically sensitive, intuitively connected, for a lot of us, it has to be rich and good and dynamic and a place where we're met and seen in order for it to be worth it. Because for a lot of us, it's just not worth it if it doesn't have the richness. But that can make us cling to somebody who's not a good match for our human self when we find that richness. And that's not the right pendulum swing either. So there's the middle path of really holding out for human self and soul self being in agreement on the thumbs up for the connection, and not being afraid then to go forward because you trust yourself to be able to take care of yourself in the dynamic. So again, lots of love and compassion. I'm imagining that if you've listened to me blather on this long, it's something that is a relevant problem for you. So I hope that this provides some relief and some self-trust and some ability to feel like you could go forward in a way that really was much more needs met in future relating. Thank you so much for joining me. To learn more about me and my work, please visit my website at handsoverheart.com. There you can join my mailing list for access to free bonus content in the members-only area. If you've enjoyed this, please consider subscribing and leaving a review. It would help me out a lot. Also, a special thank you to my patrons for your support. You offer me the time freedom to work on passion projects like this one. If you'd like to receive personal shamanic support from me and my team of guides, please consider joining my Patreon community. You'll find the link below. And again, thank you so much for listening. This is Katie Weatherup, wishing you wholeness and happiness.